Nicole, we are so happy to welcome you to the sisterhood.
I am so happy to be with you two. This is so fun for me.
So, tell us a little about where you live and kind of what you do in your daily life.
Yes, I am in Connecticut, but just outside New York City. So it's this strange tiny little coastal town, but the culture is very much the greater New York City area. And I am a marriage and family therapist. So full time for a therapist is 20 hours, 20 client hours, but I squeeze it into a part-time schedule. And the rest of the days I'm either writing or with my kiddos. I kind of write in the margins, nap time, early morning, late night margins, and spend the rest of the time playing with my littles.
Yeah, we get that. We certainly understand that life. And I think our listeners do too. They do a
Yes.
lot of things in the margins because that's how we operate, right?
Yep. And, I know balance is something that gets thrown around with working moms. It's a concept we talk about is more the goal. I just want to make sure my time is being spent in line with my values and give myself flexibility to change that throughout the seasons because I know, there's the seasons are changing all the time.
Hmm. Well,
Yeah.
and you just wrote a book.
Yes. Yes.
So tell us a little bit about your book and what really prompted you to take this. I feel like it's a unique perspective and slant.
Mm, thanks. Yeah, so my book that just released is called What If It's Wonderful? And it's about finding the courage to celebrate. And while it's about celebration, it was really born out of a season that was characterized by a lot of change and a lot of loss. All joy, but certainly some seasons lean in one direction or another. And it had been about a decade of just a really, by and large, painful season for me. And when you go through pain, whether it's a season or an event, there's the loss itself, there's what happened, and then there's the cost. And the cost is the impact to your identity and sense of safety. And what took me a really long time to realize was that part of the cost for me as I emerged from this season where I was entering into a new time of more good news and more joy, um, the part of the cost for me was that my joy was accompanied by a ton of fear. Hope and dreaming felt like they were not a good idea, and they felt very scary. It felt more responsible and safer to just plan for the worst case scenario instead of use my imagination to wonder how God could move in a delightful way. And so my eyes were just cast down, hyper vigilant for, the other shoe to drop or for disappointment or disaster. And I was so sad when I woke up one morning and realized, oh, I don't want to miss my beautiful God given life because I am so busy preparing for the worst. And I had missed out. Yes, I had experienced real and true loss, but I had also missed out on so much and lost so much because of my refusal to embrace joy.
I think many of us can relate to that. And
Mm,
probably personality plays a part in it, right? That some
mhm.
of us tend to be a little bit glass half empty, whereas others of us are a little more glass half full. Um, and even the title of your book, when I heard it, I thought, well, there's a question I don't ask very often
Right?
because I tend to be a worst case scenario because I want to be prepared, right? I'm an
Yeah.
Enneagram 6. So I like
Okay.
that makes me feel safe to think
Yes.
of the worst case scenario, not the best case scenario. So
Yeah.
how do you work or talk with people like me
Mm,
to not shame us, because I don't hear that in your language,
no.
in in how we're wired, but to help us maybe open up a little bit to the possibilities of what God might have that are good for us.
Hmm. Yes. So the brain is little help to us here in general, regardless of your personality. And you're absolutely right. There are some personalities that I think lean even more in this direction, or might determine how far we go into this space. But the book has a lot of neuroscience research in it, because it was such an important part of joy, very much. Because in my practice as a therapist and in my personal life, I realized very quickly I was not alone. Though people have lived lots of different kinds of stories looked nothing like mine, that this was a very common phenomenon, especially, of course, after the 2 years that we've all shared. But there is a lot going on in our brain that was so helpful for me to understand, just as our starting place, because few among us actually drift toward joy. The first is something called the hedonic treadmill, which basically means that our brains rapidly adapt to joy. So when we receive good news, or maybe that gift that we thought could make us want for nothing else in this life, like the ultimate joyful thing, we will feel that thrill. And then very quickly, that joy and delight and the sparkle of that moment will just kind of fade into the background. The second thing, which most of us are familiar with, but it's worth repeating, our brains are just stickier with painful information. And so pain is like Velcro in our brains, and our brains are like Teflon with joy and positive information. And part of that is because our brains are really efficient, and they only want to hang on to what they think they're going to need, which in a survival mentality is often the big and the painful things that we ruminate over and worry about. A third dynamic is that we have this strange tendency to tell our joy how it can be improved upon. So, if you think about giving a presentation that you worked really hard on, and you feel great about how it went, and it was really fun, and you saw some nods and smiles in the audience, and maybe you got a few compliments on your way back to your seat, and then you sit down and you think, it would have been better if I had said this, or it would have been better had I shared that story. Or they said I was a good speaker, or I did a good job, but they didn't say I did a great job. And we start telling our joy how it could have been better, and almost shaming what was a really delightful experience. And so to answer your question, that's our starting place. And this connects with what we find in scripture, particularly in the book of Ecclesiastes, where it says, it uses the phrase under the sun to help us understand that only what we can see, like our earthly experience, is being considered, our personal experience. And then, um, talks about heaven when it talks about possibility and imagining what God could do. And basically, what the author of Ecclesiastes says is, if all you do is look at your personal experience, so if all you do is reflect on that pain in the past, or hyper vigilant for what could go wrong, it's only going to show you a different angle of the same problem. It's just going to give you a tour of that same problem from every side, which is a great picture of worry for me, right? We're not really going anywhere. We're just walking in circles around the same problem. And so Ecclesiastes for me just points us to this beautiful trajectory. If we can, remember God's faithfulness in the past and recall his character, and then use our imagination from knowing who he is and what he's already done to think, okay, how might he move? I'm going to have a posture of curiosity and wonder about how he could move instead of worrying about what he might not do or what the problem could possibly present.
Yes, 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 yes. This is all so good. And it's the waters I swim in as a life coach. Like, this is kind of
Mm,
the stuff that we talk about. I'm reading Winning the War of Your Mind by Craig Groeschel with some high
yes,
school girls right now. And
great
we
book.
were just reading the part about, kind of the pre-framing. So when you go into situations, pre-frame it positively instead of, oh my gosh, I'm going into this. So I call this forecasting doom. So
Yep.
my husband and I talk about this a lot because I'm like, I'm feeling like there's kind of this forecasting doom happening. And that is making me feel like really uncomfortable, right? Like, let's not forecast doom. And what I really liked about this idea of pre-framing in that positive way, in a way of how is God going to surprise me and come
Yeah.
through? And how is he going to work? And that's exactly what you're saying. So I feel like, gosh, they're just holding hands. What I've been talking about with these girls is, why is it that we go into situations forecasting doom instead of pre-framing good?
Mhm.
And you had just explained it with the brain. But I'm wondering if you have some other helpful knowledge, either education or tips that would help us with that.
Mhm. Yes, I think forecasting doom pulls our brain into the future, where we will feel anxious as we prepare for all those worst case scenarios. And if you think about the what if questions we typically ask, what if I fail? What if I'm disappointed? Very few what if questions end with a positive, hopeful word like wonderful, which is one of the reasons I titled the book that way. And then if you think about how worry just carries us into the past, where we replay conversations and ruminate over what we could have, should have, would have done. So, a wonderful way that I love to celebrate, that I think is the best on ramp for celebrating the life that you already have and celebrating the ordinary, also helps to keep us very present. And it's the practice of savoring. And the reason I love savoring is it just celebrates the ordinary. You don't have to add anything to your life or change anything in your life. It's a practice that's available to all of us that helps us cultivate joy. And the way that you do that is you take a snapshot. I love to do it in the present. So if I have this moment where I just feel this sense of delight, and I'm talking a picture. So even just watching the sun hit the blonde of my son's hair as he plays in the backyard, and he's enjoying himself, and that one little picture is enough to capture that and say, you just ask your five senses what they're going to remember about that moment. So what do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you taste? And what do you feel? And that helps your brain capture and keep that delightful moment that it would be tempted to discard because of what we talked about earlier, and carry it forward in a way that you can actually recall it later and keep that moment and feel joy. The fringe benefit of that is it keeps you very present, where we are going to feel less anxious, and won't be engaging that impending doom. It changes your perspective on what's happening right now. Some people like to practice this as a reflective exercise at the end of their day and pick a snapshot from their day and then do that same, what are your five traditional senses going to remember about that memory? And you can certainly practice it that way too.
I was thinking about I tried this one time with my kids. So I had
Uh-huh.
read, I think it was The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, John Mark
Okay.
Comer's book. And it's not the same. I really like your five senses. I think that gives a great handhold, but I think his was just like, take a minute, and they do this as a family, and they,
Mhm.
just stop and just kind of go, okay, we want to remember this moment. So I
Yeah.
did it with my teenagers one time, my boys, and they're like, Mom, we don't like this.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, but I'm trying right now to have a moment with you and remember this moment. They're like, we don't like this. And so they're like, we're not going to do this. And I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, but that's beside the point. I'm just saying your teenagers might not be on board.
Nope.
However, we can be on board in our own minds, in our own space, and it really is for us,
Yep.
even though I was trying to create a family moment,
Right.
it really is for us. And I love that you said the five senses, because I think even a lot of us have a preference on what sense that we
Mhm.
prefer. And so even just playing on that strength of, like I'm really visual. So
Yep.
visual is really important to me. And I'm going to maybe take in more on the visual side, where someone else may be taking more in on the sound side or whatever. So even that, I think, is an interesting play that kind of makes it individual to the person of how they're going to remember that moment.
Yes, and some of them I've noticed as I've practiced this are more obvious. So when I'm holding my 1-year-old daughter, the weight of her on my chest is so obvious. That newborn smell that none of us can seem to figure out how to bottle is so obvious to me. But taste, not so much. But oh, okay, that lingering stale taste of coffee that's always with me from reheating my coffee all day. But all five help the brain to capture that moment. And so I just love that, because otherwise I would go through life just focused on, I'm like you, mostly on what I'm seeing, versus how the rest of my senses are recording my moments of joy.
Mhm. It's interesting because it's a writing technique as well, in
Yes.
that there's stronger writing if you are incorporating what someone heard or what they smelled or what they tasted, because it puts the person in the place so that they can experience it along with the writer.
Yes.
And it makes me think this is what embodied living is, right? We are souls with bodies, and we often separate ourselves
Yeah.
from what we're physically experiencing. And so as we stop, I mean, it's kind of mindfulness, right? Too. I
Mhm.
mean, we stop and we're paying attention to what is happening around us. We are integrating more with how God has made us to be souls walking through this world in our bodies, and our bodies understand the world through our
Yes.
senses.
No, it's funny you say that. I just had a therapy session where this woman was feeling really overwhelmed. And the whole time I'm talking to her, my throat felt like it was closing just from the way that she was reacting to her situation, but also hearing the stories that made perfect sense why she was overwhelmed. And I fed that back to her. I said, my throat feels like it's tight just listening to you. Where do you feel it in your body? And it opened up this whole different conversation, because she was able to tell me that she felt it in her jaw, and then talk about what her jaw was communicating to her, that we never would have gotten there, had we not taken the conversation out of what we were thinking, and putting it in our five sense language.
Yeah, that's really, yeah, that it's contagious too.
Hmm.
Right. So that we catch fear or we
Yes.
catch sadness and so that's an interesting thing about that, what you just said. I also want to talk about the concept of unity in joy and celebration and wonder and what's wonderful. What role does unity play, and why is that important?
Yes. So when we look at that famous verse in Romans, Paul's instruction to rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn, that whole passage is Paul's call to us to unity, which I find that instruction and knowing that the umbrella of that passage is about unity to be so interesting, because it means being willing to be interrupted by somebody else's experience. Um, my personal experience, and I've had other conversations confirm this, although I'm sure it's not the same for everybody in every community, is that in general, we tend to be a little bit better at mourning with those who mourn in some ways than we are at celebrating with those who celebrate. I'll put it in the language of the book. Um, Rejoicing with those who rejoice, especially if they're celebrating a dream that maybe steps on the toes of our own. I think it's easier to celebrate something that we have no personal goals or dreams in, but when somebody else celebrates a milestone or an experience that we would love to have for ourselves and haven't yet, I think that's where it gets really difficult. And we tend to get quiet in our celebration in this place for a couple reasons. But the story that really, frankly, kicked my tail on this one that I had never read through this lens was the story of the Israelites moving toward the promised land. And scripture says in Deuteronomy 3, they are so close to it that Moses goes on up on this mountain and he can actually see it in the distance. And of course, we know that he's been their leader through this peaks and valleys of that journey toward the promised land, but he has disobeyed God earlier in that journey. And God has told him, you're not going to be the one to lead my people in, and you're not going to step foot in the promised land yourself. And I love Moses's honesty in this moment because he pleads with God one more time. Can I please be the one to lead my people, your people, into the promised land? And it's hard to ignore. God's language is strong. In this passage, he gives an emphatic no, and it's a little bit like a teenager parent moment and says, this is the end of the conversation. We're not talking about this anymore. And where I'm really challenged, though, is by what God says to Moses next. He says, I want you to commission Joshua. I want you to pour courage into him and prepare him for the journey that you would love to have for yourself. And to me, that shed so much light, really held up the mirror to how I tend to approach, or hopefully I'm getting better, but how I used to tend to approach rejoicing with those who rejoice, and how I see it done a lot is we are good at kind of accepting somebody else's joy. Like, let's find a way to just be okay with it, privately. And often what I see this looking like is, well, they have that, but I have this. It's sort of like this strange equalizing competition, really unhealthy mental exercise of boosting ourselves up, in a way that could potentially tear someone down. And we just sort of find a way to be okay with it. But God's call here is, no, I want you to actively help somebody prepare for that journey. I want you to stuff their backpack with encouragement and practical help that helps them find their way, toward that dream and helps prepare them for that dream. And so I think there's an active component to celebrating with those who celebrate, that's not just finding a way to be okay with somebody else's joy, but joining them in that and helping them prepare for it, and helping them enhance their joy in that experience.
This is very much the tenor of the sisterhood. This is
Ah,
what we are all about
I
here,
love it. I love it.
is encouraging each other to do that.
Mhm.
So how would you encourage somebody or give some practical steps for someone who's like, I want to do that, but dang it, I don't know how to start. I don't because the mental game is still going on in my head, where I'm
Mhm.
feeling like I'm disappointed and it's hard for me to be around her. And you're
Mhm.
asking me to do this hard thing. What's the next step that someone can do when they're in that place where they have the desire and yet they have some conflicting feelings going on?
Yes, and I really understand that, and depending on, there's so many different situations that we could name. For me, for many years, it was, I was in this life stage where all my friends were getting pregnant and having babies, and my husband and I have a diagnosis that means when I get pregnant, it's more than a 50% chance that I won't get to meet that baby, that I'll lose that baby to miscarriage. And suffered through 5 of those in this season where everybody, it seemed, was growing their families. And first, I want to say, just as a side, find a safe place to process the pain that comes with that, because that is real and your feelings are valid, um, in grieving what isn't true for you that's true for somebody else. So whether that's therapy or a trusted friend that you can be honest with and cry with, and talk about, yes, there's joy that is valid over there, and there's pain. The joy doesn't cancel your pain. That would be toxic positivity, where we expect what is good to cancel what is hard. That both can be true. But I think what was helpful to me is remembering that, um, feelings follow actions. And that's another, it's not my favorite thing about the brain, honestly. I want to feel like doing something before I do it. I want the actions to be the result of me just feeling really motivated and passionate about doing something. But the reality is that we can think and act our way to a new feeling. We can't really feel our way to a new way of thinking and acting. So, as I found a safe place to process my pain and my very real and valid feelings, I started using my hands. I would make bouquets of flowers to celebrate my friends that were pregnant, and join them in that joy, by dropping a note off or making a bouquet of flowers from my garden or just doing something active, and service oriented that helped move my heart into a place of being able to draw close to them in that joy. And what was so beautiful is that a lot of these friendships are close friends of mine, and they were just as eager to listen to what was hard. And I had this really brutal conversation. I'll call it a brutal conversation because it was so beautiful and really hard at the same time. Um, I was pregnant with my son, my first son, and my friend who had walked through all of this pain with me was pregnant with her third, her daughter. And she sobbed telling me this good news because she was so worried. Statistically, she would get to meet her baby, and statistically, I would not. And she just didn't want to be the cause of more pain for me. And I just held her hand and looked at her and said, we could get quiet in our own experiences. You could feel like you're, um, causing me pain in your joy, and I might feel like I'm raining on your parade by, grieving in the midst of your joy. And I said, or we could just do both together and experience the joy of having a friendship that can hold both, that is rare and beautiful and not many people have. And we chose the latter. Now, it did turn out that we got to meet both of these babies and they're now best friends, but um the joy of doing both together was such a gift that we would have missed out on had we allowed that to be a private experience because we were worried about bumping into the opposite experience.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really powerful story. And I like how you named it. And, I always say this to my kids and various people, that the mark of a true friend is not someone who will cry with you, but someone who will actually celebrate with you when something good happens to you. That's a
Yes.
true friend who will. And sometimes that is hard. And you have to
Mhm.
have that awkward conversation of saying, in fact, I just had this the other day with a friend, and I said, I know this is a little bit awkward, but we're going to refuse to let it be. We're going
Yeah.
to push past this instead, because I want to be someone who can celebrate with you in this moment, even though it's a little bit of a painful moment. But I
Mm.
want to be someone who can celebrate with you. And so let's just name it for what it
Yep.
is. And then let's go from there. And
Yes.
I'm going to, because I'm choosing that I want to be here for you in the celebration of this.
Yeah.
And that was really freeing, I think, for both of us. And that's what I hear in your story too, of just you freed each other to just have this experience together, knowing that, yeah, this could end up a little bit really hard,
Yep.
but that's okay because we're going to hold it together.
Hmm. And it would have been so much harder had we done both of those experiences by ourselves. And
Mhm.
I love that you mentioned naming it and naming the choice, and in you choosing that. Um, and I don't even know what the circumstance was, but in the choice, and saying that doesn't mean that I'm still not going to hurt. Even
Mhm.
if to yourself, like there's lots of complicated feelings that come along with that choice, but this is still what I want to choose, and it's the better thing, and I want to do that with you, and I know that you're going to grieve with me in my experience too.
Because if we're honest, we hardly ever experience pure joy or pure grief, right? Life is a
Right.
mix.
Yeah.
So if we're next to other people and we're experiencing that mix together, it it just is more honest. And so that's what I was thinking of with both of you, is the honesty that was involved, and that takes an element of trust. And at the same time, the more you do that with a certain friend, the more honest you are with each other and the more you build trust. So
Yes.
you kind of have to take those first few steps that feel like a risk, because they are. You
Mhm.
didn't know how your friend would respond, and it was a risk, maybe a calculated one based
Mhm.
on what you knew of her.
Sure.
Um, but we do have to put ourselves out there a little bit in order to then have that first honest conversation that then
Yeah.
builds trust, to have another honest conversation. I mean, Krista
Yeah.
and I have had a lot of honest conversations over the years, and
Yeah.
it's because we
Nothing
have a
happens if nothing happens, right? Like
right.
you're exactly right. There's that brave decision, and then that builds trust for the next time. And yeah, and I think hardly any of us are ever experiencing the same kind of season at the same time too. To be in community is to live a lot of different stories with your loved ones at the same time. And I think when we get quiet, in Revelation it says we will conquer by the blood of the lamb and the testimony of our victory. And I love that word testimony, because obviously not one of us or our stories carries a complete picture of Christ. We're all made in his image. We all have stories that he's moving in, but we, on our own, we don't carry a complete picture of Christ and what he's doing. And when we show up in community and we start telling our testimonies, whether we're in a season of pain or joy, about how God is moving in our hearts and how he's moving in our relationships and how he's moving in our stories, we get a more full picture of all the ways that God shows up for us, that I would never realize if I was just living by myself, privately, never sharing, in the context of communities. So the unity element of celebration and of vulnerability around our pain is really important.
One of the things that I've heard a lot is that people often, the play is the most vulnerable act, or being silly, or
Mhm.
because you have to let your guard down in front of someone enough to look dumb, or to, have that. And so I can see how this celebration piece, there's a level of vulnerability I think that could be really hard for people. How do you help people get over that hurdle?
Uh-huh. You're exactly right. Joy is the most vulnerable feeling that we feel. Brene Brown talks a lot about this because joy involves holding something, and it automatically is accompanied by the possibility of loss, of losing that thing. And so that brings us back to the beginning of our conversation, where a lot of us find it easier to not hold that than to hold something that might break. And so I think there's no getting around the practice component of this. This is where savoring is really helpful. Also, the practice of Thanksgiving. This is a little bit different than gratitude, although gratitude does increase our joy and does help us be courageous in that joyful place, because it helps us notice and name what is good. So, in the noticing, we're changing our perspective. All of a sudden, we're not casting down, our eyes aren't cast down, hyper vigilant for what's going wrong. Our gaze is lifted for what is good. And then that naming just helps us put a structure around it and language to it in a way that we can carry it forward. What we don't often talk about is that Thanksgiving, actually expressing that gratitude that we feel, doubles the joy that we glean from gratitude. So if I tell a friend, here is the difference your presence makes in my life. Here's how I've grown because of our conversations and because of the ways that you've loved me so well. Here's how I've been so encouraged, and here's what I'm learning because of you. That doubles my joy that I would have experienced had I just felt that in my heart because it's shared. Not to mention, hopefully, the ways that the recipient would feel in increasing their joy. So I think that Thanksgiving piece, even beyond gratitude, helps us feel more courageous in that joy, but also the vulnerability of sharing that. And it can be a vulnerable thing. And it can be a vulnerable thing to receive affirmation. Both are celebratory. And I talk about both in my book. But those are just simple practices that A, increase your joy, and B, help you feel more courageous in it.
Yeah, it's so great. It's really helpful, Nicole. I love this conversation so much. As we are kind of rounding out our interview today, what would be just a charge or a word of encouragement that you would give to people as they maybe are considering some of these things for the first time?
Mhm. Well, the first word of encouragement I would say is that if you are in a season of suffering where you just feel like you can't rejoice, just know that celebration, you're not disqualified from it. Celebration is a rhythm of remembrance more than it is a reaction to good news. Sometimes it does look like that, and I don't want to shame that experience or diminish that experience. It's awesome when celebration looks like that, and we should celebrate that. But often it is a rhythm of remembrance, remembering how God has been faithful to you, remembering what is true and good, that carries us in that celebration in seasons of suffering. I've often been asked, do you think we need to demonstrate a certain level of hope or joy before God is willing to intervene in our circumstances? And I love the honesty of that question because I feel like a lot of us carry that and don't say it. And I just want to encourage anyone listening that might feel that way. There's a lot of joy to be had when we take God at his word and when we consider what is possible with him. But God's goodness is not a function of our goodness. His faithfulness is not a function of our faith. He is faithful to you and good to you, regardless of whether or not hope and joy feel accessible to you right now. I just think there's so much beautiful connection with God in the midst of our joy, and so much hope for us when we're able to take him at his word.
Mm. Yeah. Amen to that. Thank you, Nicole. This has been such a great conversation. And I
Oh, I
think
so
one that
was.
can really shift how people operate in the world if taken to heart. And so I think that's my prayer as we're closing this, that people would really take this to heart and read your book and dive deeper into this as
Oh,
a concept that maybe they haven't considered before. So thank you so much.
thank you. I loved this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Bye, Nicole.
Bye.